The assassin's blade missed Niccolò Machiavelli's throat by mere inches as he ducked into the shadows of a narrow Florentine alleyway. The year was 1513, and his crime was neither theft nor murder. It was falling from political grace in a republic that had once embraced him. As he fled through the midnight streets, a thought crystallized in his mind: perhaps being virtuous in a world of wolves was not wisdom but folly. This paradox would haunt him through his exile and eventually birth one of history's most controversial political treatises. What if everything we've been taught about goodness is dangerous? What if our moral compass points toward our own destruction? The beautiful illusion Maria Rossi, a modern-day non-profit director in Rome, smiles as she approves another loan to a struggling local business, her fifth this month. Her organization's mission is clear: help those in need with interest-free microloans. Her board praises her compassion, her community celebrates her generosity, yet behind closed doors, 3 of her employees are embezzling funds, leveraging her trusting nature to siphon resources. By the time she discovers their betrayal, nearly 40% of her annual budget will have vanished. "I believed in people's inherent goodness," she will later confess to a journalist. "I never imagined my kindness would become a weapon used against me." Maria's story is neither unique nor modern. It represents a pattern as old as civilization itself: the vulnerable position of the purely good-hearted, in a world where not everyone shares their moral framework. In the grand ballrooms of 16th-century Florence, Machiavelli observed similar patterns among the elite. Those who refused to engage in necessary political maneuvering, who insisted on transparent honesty in all dealings, rarely maintained their positions. Their virtue became the ladder, others climbed to supplant them. Their goodness was not rewarded, it was exploited. "I'm not interested in preserving the status quo, I want to overthrow it," Machiavelli once remarked. But this revolutionary wasn't advocating for moral chaos, rather he was piercing the veil of a dangerous illusion, that goodness alone protects the good. The philosophy of necessary evil on a cold winter night in a modest country home, exiled from the political life he treasured. Machiavelli penned words that would echo through 5 centuries. A man who wishes to make a profession of goodness in everything must necessarily come to grief among so many who are not good. Born May 3, 1469, in Florence, Machiavelli served as a diplomat and political advisor during the height of the Florentine Republic. He witnessed firsthand the fall of powerful families, the rise of tyrants, and the complicated dance of alliances that kept Italian city-states in constant flux. His observations weren't theoretical abstractions, they were survival lessons written in the blood of those who failed to understand power's true nature. Consider the fate of Piero Soderini, Florence's gonfaloniere chief magistrate from 1502 to 1512. Machiavelli served under him, and witnessed his downfall. Soderini was widely regarded as a good man, fair, reluctant to punish enemies, committed to democratic principles. When the powerful Medici family moved to retake control of Florence, Soderini refused to take preemptive action against them, believing his moral authority would protect the Republic. It didn't. The Medici returned, Soderini was exiled, and Florence's Republican experiment ended. Machiavelli himself was tortured on suspicion of conspiracy, and then banished to his country estate. From this painful experience came his most profound insight: virtue without power is vulnerability. The prince who neglects what is done for what ought to be done, sooner effects his ruin than his preservation, he wrote in chapter 15 of The Prince. This wasn't a prescription for evil but a pragmatic assessment that idealism detached from reality leads to catastrophe, not just for the ruler, but for all who depend on them. The neuroscience of naive goodness. Modern neuroscience offers fascinating insights into why Machiavelli's warnings remain relevant. Dr. Eleanor Kaufman at Harvard University has studied what she calls pathological altruism, cases where good intentions lead to harmful outcomes because of cognitive blind spots. The brain's reward centers activate powerfully when we engage in what we perceive as moral behavior, explains Kaufman. This creates a kind of neurological feedback loop that can override critical thinking. We become so addicted to the feeling of being good that we fail to assess whether our actions are actually producing good results. Brain imaging studies show that when subjects make decisions they consider morally righteous, the ventral striatum, a key component of the brain's reward system, lights up with activity. This same region activates when we eat delicious food or experience physical pleasure, creating powerful reinforcement for behaviors we categorize as good, regardless of their consequences. This neurological reality helps explain why well-intentioned leaders throughout history have maintained failing policies, despite mounting evidence of harm. The psychological reward of moral certainty can overwhelm objective evaluation of outcomes. Machiavelli understood this tendency 5 centuries before we had the technology to observe it directly. Men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, he observed, because it belongs to everybody to see you, to few to come in touch with you. In other words, humans are more influenced by appearances than realities, including our own self-perception as moral actors. The idealist believes in their own goodness so completely that they become blind to manipulation, exploitation, and the unintended consequences of their actions. The dark forest theory of human relations. Liu Cixin, the acclaimed Chinese science fiction author, popularized the concept of the dark forest theory in his novel The Three-Body Problem. Though created as an explanation for why advanced civilizations might hide from each other in the cosmos, the theory applies equally well to human social dynamics. The theory posits that in an environment where resources are finite and survival is not guaranteed, 1. All entities want to survive. 2. There is no way to know others' true intentions. 3. All have some capacity to harm others. 4. Given uncertainty, preemptive action may be rational. Within this framework, pure goodness, transparent, predictable, unwilling to defend itself, becomes a dangerous evolutionary strategy. The naive idealist who announces their peaceful intentions and exposes their vulnerabilities provides a clear target in the dark forest. Machiavelli's Florence was the epitome of such an environment. City-states competed for limited resources, powerful families schemed against one another, and foreign powers like France and Spain saw Italy as a prize to be carved up and claimed. Since love and fear can hardly exist together, if we must choose between them, it is far safer to be feared than loved, Machiavelli advised. This wasn't a rejection of love or goodness as virtues, but a pragmatic assessment that fear creates reliable behavioral boundaries, while goodness alone does not. The historical record validates his observation. The idealistic Roman Emperor Pertinax attempted to reform a corrupt system through moral leadership and personal example. His reign lasted 3 months before the Praetorian Guard assassinated him. His successor Didius Julianus purchased the throne by promising the guards wealth and privilege. He understood the dark forest rules that Pertinax fatally ignored. A different path, strategic goodness, but must we abandon goodness entirely? Is Machiavelli truly advocating for amorality as the only viable approach to life? A closer reading of his work suggests otherwise. What Machiavelli opposed was not goodness itself, but naive goodness, virtue divorced from strategic thinking. It is necessary for a prince who wishes to maintain himself to learn how not to be good, and to use this knowledge and not use it according to the necessity of the case, he wrote. The key phrase is according to the necessity of the case. Machiavelli advocated for contextual ethics, understanding when traditional virtue serves your aims, and when it undermines them. Professor Sarah Adams of Oxford's Department of Political Philosophy suggests we might call this strategic goodness, rather than amorality. Machiavelli doesn't tell us to be evil, she argues. He tells us to be effective. Sometimes effectiveness aligns with conventional morality, and sometimes it requires actions that appear, at least on the surface, to contradict it. Consider the case of Abraham Lincoln during the American Civil War. Though remembered as a moral leader, Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, imprisoned political opponents without trial, and initially limited his Emancipation Proclamation to only those slaves in Confederate territories. These actions violated his personal ethical preferences, but served his larger moral goal, preserving the Union, and eventually ending slavery. Lincoln practiced strategic goodness. He understood, as Machiavelli did, that pure idealism without pragmatic action accomplishes nothing. I hope to have God on my side, Lincoln reportedly said, but I must have Kentucky. The transformation from naive to nuanced goodness. How then might the modern idealist survive and thrive without abandoning their core values? Machiavelli's writings, properly understood, offer a framework for transformation. 1. Recognize reality as it is, not as you wish it to be. Machiavelli insisted that effective leaders see things as they are, not as they should be. Before you can change the world, you must see it clearly. 2. Develop appropriate skepticism. All men are bad, and will use their badness on any occasion, Machiavelli warned. While this assessment is arguably too harsh, a healthy skepticism prevents exploitation and betrayal. 3. Build power before implementing change. In Machiavelli's world, powerless virtue is merely decorative. To effect good, you must first secure the means to implement it. This may require temporary compromises. 4. Master appearances, while maintaining internal clarity. Everyone sees what you appear to be, few perceive what you are, he observed. The wise practitioner of strategic goodness understands the difference between public perception and private reality. 5. Employ necessary severity, quickly and completely. When actions that appear harsh are truly necessary, Machiavelli advises executing them swiftly and thoroughly, rather than prolonging suffering through half measures. 6. Reserve true goodness for those who have earned trust. While maintaining a reputation for fairness broadly, Machiavelli suggests reserving complete transparency and vulnerability for a small circle of proven allies. Dr. Robert Greene, author of the 48 Laws of Power, notes that these principles don't require abandoning ethics, they simply place ethics within a strategic framework. The truly good person in Machiavelli's world isn't the one with clean hands and empty results, Greene argues. It's the one who accomplishes meaningful good by understanding how power actually works. The garden in the dark forest picture, a garden in the middle of a dark forest. Without walls, without protections, it will be trampled and consumed. But with appropriate boundaries, with strategic goodness rather than naive exposure, it can thrive even in hostile surroundings. This is Machiavelli's ultimate message to idealists. Your goodness is too important to be sacrificed on the altar of purity. If you truly believe in your values, you must protect them with more than intentions. You must learn the rules of power, the dynamics of human nature, and the strategic application of both virtue and its occasional, necessary suspension. Consider Nelson Mandela, who began as an idealistic young lawyer committed to nonviolence, then founded the militant wing of the African National Congress, when he realized peaceful methods alone would not end apartheid. During his 27 years in prison, he studied his enemies carefully, learning to speak Afrikaans, and understanding the fears and motivations of the regime. When finally released, he employed strategic forgiveness, not because he had forgotten the injustices, but because reconciliation served his larger goal of a unified South Africa. Mandela was neither a pure idealist, nor a pure Machiavellian. He was something more powerful, a strategic idealist, who understood that the means must sometimes adapt to preserve the ends. The warning and the hope. As night fell over Florence on June 21, 1527, Niccolò Machiavelli took his final breath, dying at the age of 58. His last years had been spent in relative obscurity, his political advice largely ignored by the restored Medici rulers he had hoped to impress with the prince. The ultimate irony of Machiavelli's life is that he himself failed to fully implement the principles he advocated. His attempts to regain political influence through his writings were transparent and unsuccessful. Perhaps in his final moments, he recognized that his greatest contribution would not be as a practitioner of power, but as its most clear-eyed analyst. 5 centuries later, his warning to idealists remains urgently relevant. Being good, truly effectively good, requires more than intention. It requires strategy. It requires understanding power. Sometimes it requires actions that appear, on the surface, to contradict our highest values in service of those very same values. Is being good dangerous? Yes, when that goodness is naive, strategic and blind to reality. But strategic goodness, virtue paired with clear-eyed understanding of human nature and power dynamics, remains our best hope for meaningful positive change. As you walk the path between idealism and effectiveness, remember Machiavelli, not as an advocate for cruelty, but as a surgeon who cut away comfortable illusions to reveal an uncomfortable truth. In a world that is not entirely good, the good must learn to be powerful, if they wish their goodness to matter. The dark forest will always exist, but with wisdom, with strategy, with Machiavellian insight tempered by genuine commitment to positive values, gardens can still grow within it. The question is not whether to be good, it is how to make that goodness effective in a complex, sometimes hostile world. Machiavelli's final warning to idealists might be this: it is not enough to have clean hands, if those hands are empty. Fill them with understanding, with strategy, with power wisely applied, and then your goodness may truly change the world. Machiavelli in the philosophical arena, competing visions of goodness. To truly understand Machiavelli's radical perspective, we must place it in conversation with other philosophical traditions. His pragmatic approach to virtue stands in stark contrast, and sometimes surprising alignment, with thinkers across time and culture. The Kantian rejection, perhaps no philosophical system, stands in more direct opposition to Machiavelli's than Immanuel Kant's deontological ethics. The 18th century German philosopher built his moral framework on absolute principles rather than consequences. Act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Kant famously declared in his formulation of the categorical imperative. For Kant, the moral worth of an action depends entirely on the principle behind it, not its results. Lying is always wrong, regardless of circumstance. Using others as means to an end, even a noble one, violates human dignity. From a Kantian perspective, Machiavelli's advice to princes represents everything wrong with consequentialist thinking. Dr. Christine Korsgaard of Harvard University, a leading Kantian scholar, puts it bluntly: Machiavelli sacrifices moral purity for effectiveness, but Kant would argue this sacrifice is never worth making. Once you compromise fundamental principles, you've already lost what you claim to be fighting for. Yet history presents uncomfortable challenges to the Kantian ideal. Consider the case of the Danish resistance during World War II. When Nazi officers asked if they were hiding Jews, resistance members lied without hesitation. By Kant's standards, these lies were morally wrong, regardless of their protective intent. But few would condemn these life-saving deceptions. The problem with Kant, noted philosopher Susan Wolf, is that he assumes a world where everyone plays by the same moral rules. Machiavelli understood that such a world has never existed. Aristotle's middle path. Surprisingly, Machiavelli shares more common ground with Aristotle than first appears. The ancient Greek philosopher developed virtue ethics, the idea that goodness comes from developing excellent character traits, rather than following rigid rules or maximizing positive outcomes. Aristotle's concept of phronesis, practical wisdom, bears remarkable similarity to Machiavelli's emphasis on context-specific decision-making. Both thinkers recognized that virtue requires judgment, not just blind adherence to principles. Virtue aims at the mean, Aristotle wrote in Nicomachean Ethics, suggesting that virtues like courage represent a middle ground between extremes like rashness and cowardice. This nuanced approach allows for adaptation to circumstances, a fundamentally Machiavellian insight. Where they diverge is on the ultimate purpose of virtue. For Aristotle, virtue exists for its own sake, as the path to eudaimonia, human flourishing. Machiavelli, ever the pragmatist, sees virtue primarily as instrumental, valuable when it helps achieve concrete goals, dispensable when it becomes an obstacle. Professor Melissa Lane of Princeton University suggests this difference stems from their historical contexts. Aristotle wrote for the educated elite in a stable Greek polis. Machiavelli wrote amid the brutal power politics of Renaissance Italy. Their different environments naturally led to different conclusions about how much one can afford to prioritize moral purity. Confucius and the harmony of virtue and power, half a world away, and nearly 2,000 years before Machiavelli, Confucius developed a philosophy that offers a fascinating counterpoint to the Florentines' approach. The Chinese sage emphasized Ren benevolence and Lai proper ritual and conduct as the foundation for both personal virtue and political stability. Unlike Machiavelli, Confucius believed that moral authority was the most sustainable form of power, that genuine virtue would naturally command respect and loyalty. To govern by virtue, let us compare it to the North Star. It maintains its place, and the multitude of stars pay it homage. Confucius wrote in the Analects. Yet despite this apparent idealism, Confucius was no naive moralist. He understood power dynamics, and the necessity of sometimes appearing stern. When you govern with leniency, the people become lax. When you govern with severity, they have no resentment. This balance between moral leadership and practical authority represents a middle ground between Machiavellian pragmatism and pure idealism. As sinologist Daniel Bell notes, Confucian political philosophy avoided both the excessive pragmatism that sacrifices all principle and the rigid moralism that ignores political reality. The Tang dynasty Emperor Taizong, 598–649 CE exemplified this synthesis. Known for both his military skill
and his commitment to Confucian virtue, he created a framework where power and goodness reinforced, rather than undermined each other. His reign is still considered one of China's golden ages. Nietzsche, Machiavelli's unexpected ally. Friedrich Nietzsche, the 19th century German philosopher, known for his critique of conventional morality, found in Machiavelli a kindred spirit. Both thinkers rejected what they saw as the life-denying aspects of traditional moral systems. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche praised Machiavelli for his unvarnished and unsentimentalized humanity. Both philosophers understood morality as historically contingent rather than divinely ordained, a human creation that often served to protect the weak and constrain the strong. Nietzsche's concept of master morality versus slave morality parallels Machiavelli's distinction between the ethics of rulers and the ethics of the ruled. Both recognized that different positions in society might require different ethical frameworks. Nietzsche and Machiavelli were both fundamentally concerned with human flourishing, explains philosopher Brian Leiter. They just understood that conventional morality often works against this flourishing by denying fundamental aspects of human nature. Where they part ways is on the ultimate vision of human excellence. Nietzsche's Übermensch transcends conventional morality to create new values. Machiavelli's ideal prince masters conventional morality to achieve concrete political ends. One looks beyond the moral system entirely, the other manipulates it from within. The Rousseauian challenge. No philosophical confrontation with Machiavelli would be complete without Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who directly attacked the prince in his writings. The 18th century Swiss philosopher believed humans were naturally good but corrupted by society, a direct contradiction of Machiavelli's dim view of human nature. Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. Rousseau famously wrote, arguing that political systems should be built on the natural goodness of humanity, rather than assuming its corruption. Rousseau found Machiavelli's pragmatism not just morally offensive, but ultimately unnecessary. If political systems were properly designed around the general will, he believed, the tension between effective governance and moral goodness would disappear. Machiavelli was writing for corrupt princes in corrupt times, Rousseau argued. His advice is poison in a healthy republic. Yet history has been kinder to Machiavelli's assessment of human nature than Rousseau's. The French Revolution, partly inspired by Rousseauian ideals, descended into the Reign of Terror, a pattern repeated in many revolutionary movements that assumed human virtue would flourish once oppressive structures were removed. Dr. Jonathan Israel, historian of the Enlightenment, observes, Rousseau's belief in natural human goodness has proven far more dangerous than Machiavelli's skepticism. Assuming the best about human nature has often led to shock, disillusionment, and ultimately political violence, when that assumption proved incorrect. Hannah Arendt, The Modern Synthesis, perhaps the most nuanced engagement with Machiavelli's insights, comes from 20th century political philosopher Hannah Arendt. Having witnessed the horrors of totalitarianism firsthand, as a Jewish refugee from Nazi Germany, Arendt understood both the necessity of power and its dangers. In The Human Condition and On Revolution, Arendt developed a concept of political action that acknowledged Machiavellian realities while maintaining core humanitarian values. Like Machiavelli, she recognized that politics has its own logic distinct from personal morality. Unlike Machiavelli, she insisted that this logic must ultimately serve human freedom and dignity. Arendt's concept of the banality of evil offers a crucial update to Machiavellian thinking. The greatest political dangers, she argued, come not from calculated malice, but from thoughtlessness, the willingness to follow orders and procedures without moral reflection. The sad truth is that most evil is done by people who never make up their minds to be good or evil, she wrote. This insight suggests a modification to Machiavelli's approach. Strategic goodness requires not just pragmatism, but careful moral deliberation to avoid becoming mechanical and inhuman. Professor Sila Benhabib suggests that Arendt offers what might be called a post-Machiavellian politics, one that acknowledges his insights about power, while refusing to abandon the possibility of genuine political ethics. The integrated vision toward a new understanding. What emerges from this philosophical confrontation is not the triumph of any single perspective, but the possibility of integration. Each tradition captures something essential about the relationship between goodness and effectiveness. From Kant, we take the importance of moral boundaries, lines that should not be crossed regardless of circumstance. From Aristotle, we adopt the concept of practical wisdom, the ability to adapt principles to complex realities. From Confucius, we learn that moral authority can itself be a source of power, rather than merely its limitation. From Nietzsche, we gain permission to question whether conventional morality always serves human flourishing. From Rousseau, we preserve hope in human potential, while acknowledging our capacity for both good and evil. From Arendt, we inherit a vision of politics that respects power realities, while insisting they serve human freedom. And from Machiavelli himself, we take the core insight that effectiveness matters, that good intentions without results are ultimately empty. Perhaps the true warning to idealists is not that they must abandon their values, but that they must engage in the difficult work of integration, bringing together moral vision with practical wisdom, ethical boundaries with strategic effectiveness, hope for humanity with clear-eyed assessment of its limitations. The businessman who pulls his company out of an authoritarian country, sacrificing profit for principle, may seem to reject Machiavelli, but if that action is part of a carefully considered strategy to build long-term reputation and align with emerging ethical standards in global markets, he is practicing precisely the kind of strategic goodness Machiavelli might recognize. The politician who compromises on policy details while maintaining core commitments isn't abandoning principle, but applying it effectively within complex constraints. The activist who studies power dynamics to more effectively challenge them honors both ideal and reality. In each case, goodness becomes not a rigid adherence to abstract principles, but a skilled navigation of complex human systems in service of genuine human flourishing. The final paradox: as dawn breaks over Florence, we return to where we began, with Machiavelli fleeing through darkened streets, his ideals and aspirations seemingly shattered by political reality. The final paradox of his life and work is this: in warning idealists of the dangers of naive goodness, he ultimately served the cause of effective goodness. By stripping away comfortable illusions, he forced us to confront the real conditions under which virtue must operate, if it hopes to make a difference in the world. Is being good dangerous? Yes, when that goodness refuses to acknowledge reality, when it becomes rigid dogma rather than living principle, when it prioritizes moral purity over actual human well-being. But strategic goodness, informed by philosophical wisdom across traditions, aware of power dynamics, committed to effectiveness without abandoning core values, remains humanity's best hope for creating the world we wish to inhabit. The true Machiavellian lesson for idealists might be this: power without principle is empty, principle without power is blind. Only in their integration do we find the path forward.